All right. Good morning, Doug. What do you think about this debt default? Is it finally going to happen?
Well, I think it's kabuki theater. It's a tempest in a teacup, or perhaps a tempest in a toilet bowl would be more accurate. Uh, Look, this. Let's go back to the debt. Should the U.S. government have any debt? Uh, this all started with Alexander Hamilton, who's looked upon as a founding father, but he was like the evil influence among the founding fathers, as far as I'm concerned. Uh, like the idea of government debt, like the idea of all kinds of bad things. Um, Look, $34 billion trillion, dollars of debt, or however much it is, it's never going to be repaid. It's absolutely cosmically impossible to ever repay that debt. So who are they kidding? What's going to happen to that debt when you owe so much money that it can never be repaid? So I've thought about this, and uh, I'm all for defaulting on the debt. And I don't know if we've talked about this much in the
You
past.
mentioned it in passing, but we never went into detail on it. It seems like that's the libertarian would say it's a contract. You're not supposed to violate that, wouldn't they say? Yeah.
Yeah, well, let's look at this. Why do I? Yes, that's something we can argue about. Um, but let's look at the reasons why we should default on the debt. And I hate to say we, it's not we, it's the US government's debt. And that's another thing that we can argue about. Is it we, the people, that have contracted this? No, that's all bullshit. But let me give you what I think is the first and most important reason why that debt should be defaulted on, is that although it'll never be repaid, it's got to be serviced over time. And especially as interest rates head back up to where they should be. And of course, only that moron Powell or Yellen, those people know where they should be. But it seems to me that they've got to be positive and above the rate of currency debasement. So at that point, yes, the debt will still be serviced, but it's going to be a gigantic amount to service that debt. And the biggest problem, I can name a number, which I will do, is that it basically turns future generations of Americans into serfs to pay the debt. And I'm opposed to that. They didn't contract it, but they're saddled with it. I mean, that's not fair. And of
Totally
course,
unethical.
it's unethical. Yeah, I have problems with the word fair in this context, but it's certainly unethical to shunt your spending off on somebody else.
Mm-hmm.
So that's the first reason. As a matter of ethics and morality, the unborn generation shouldn't have to pay it. But unless you default on it, they're going to have to service it. So that's number one. Number two is more practical. It's that if the debt has been growing, it might be compared to a 100-story building built on a foundation of sand. And if you have a building that's obviously going to collapse, that is unsustainable, to use a popular word, it's better to have a controlled demolition of the building than just let it fall randomly, unexpectedly on anybody that's in it at the time. And this 34 trillion, actually it's 200 trillion, because there's all kinds of things which are hidden and all kinds of things which will be activated if things go wrong. And they don't count the unfunded liabilities of Medicare and Social Security and the rest of that. So people conjecture that have thought about these. It's more like 200 trillion. So you've got to have a controlled demolition of this thing. And just like when any building falls, it's going to make a mess. But it does the least amount of damage when you do it that way. So that's the second reason that I think is very important. The third reason, I think, is more philosophical. And that is that the US government has become an entity unto itself. It's not we, the people. It's as separate from society as General Motors is. Mm. And I'd say if General Motors defaults on its debt, that's the problem of the management and the shareholders. Well, of course, when you get politics involved, it becomes the problem of the taxpayers because they bail out General Motors. But I think if people think about this, they'll see that it's really the government's problem. It's not my problem. It's not your problem. It's the government's problem and the people that feed off the government, because the government is a parasite. So, yeah, I'd like to see that happen, and it would be depowered from that point of view. Going back to another thing from a practical point of view is that all the real wealth in the world, in the country, will still be there if the debt defaults. I mean, the fields and the factories and the technologies and the skills of the workers, that's not going to change. It's just going to change ownership. Some people are going to lose it, and it'll just change ownership. Now, who gets it? Well, of course, a lot of that's going to depend on who controls the apparatus of the state at that point. Another indication that the state is just way, way too powerful. But another fifth reason, I guess, is that default, nasty as it is, and this speaks to what you said, well, don't we have a contract? Didn't somebody make a contract with the people that, yeah, they did. But since it's never going to be repaid, there's only two things that can happen to it. It can be inflated out of existence, or it can be defaulted on. But if it's inflated out of existence, which they're hoping for by keeping interest rates lower than the rate of inflation, inflation is the worst thing that can happen to a society. It's much worse than an honest default, which only hurts some people. But inflation hurts everybody. So, yeah, I don't want to see it inflated out of existence. I'd like to see it honestly defaulted on. And that leads to, I guess, what would be the sixth thing. And that is that it would punish the enablers who've lent the government all that money, which is basically used for stupid and destructive things. So, once again, from a moral point of view, I'm all for punishing the enablers. And who owns all that government debt? You might ask yourself. Well, it's basically the rich people that have gotten themselves politically connected. So I want to punish them as enablers. And I don't mind that stolen money is basically taken back away from them. So I think more or less, the real wealth will devolve probably more to the people and away from the ruling classes. So I think there's other reasons, but those are the ones on the top of my head why it should be defaulted on.
Yeah, I think the most obvious point that you mentioned is just that it's inevitable. Like the question is it a honest default or is it a dishonest default through inflation? A dishonest and more destructive default through inflation that punishes people who had nothing to do with it.
Yeah, that's right. It's inevitable. So I think it makes sense to recognize reality and deal with it sooner rather than later.
Yeah.
Instead of kicking the can down the road, which is what they want to do when somebody else is in office. So there's every reason to default on it. It'll be unpleasant. It'll be there'll be a time of chaos, certainly, but it's not going to be as bad as the time of chaos that's going to arise if they keep propping things up. And let me give you another reason. It would make it impossible for the government to borrow.
Exactly. And that's why they'd rather inflate than default.
Sure, it would devolve power away from the central government because they don't dare raise taxes to the extent that, no, they'd have to cut spending radically if they had to stop borrowing. So that's another reason. So what reasons are there for raising the debt ceiling and continuing to keep the charade going? We should look at that because there are some.
Yeah, there are. But I mean, the only real argument that you hear from politicians as they lead up to any debt ceiling is that America is always good and honest. It has never defaulted on our debt. We're not welfare queens. We're gonna make the payment. So they try and use this moral argument. You hear Biden make it, or Janet Yellen making that as a reason why we shouldn't default. And other than that, maybe they say it'll be bad for the financial markets, but in some vague way, they don't really explain. They just say it's our moral obligation.
Well, government as an entity doesn't believe in morality. And I know that Americans are used to thinking of themselves or their government as being the good guys. Hey, we fought Hitler, Okay, well, that's very nice. But the U.S. has defaulted on its debt in the past. It defaulted on its debt in 1933 when Roosevelt, fraudulently devalued the dollar, raised the price of gold from $20 to $35, and took everybody's gold away before that happened. And that was a default that affected everybody, Americans, but also affected foreigners who thought for each dollar they were going to get, more gold, real money. And Nixon defaulted too when he closed the gold window to foreigners. So, that's just simply a lie when they say that.
But Americans don't know anything about history, it seems, so they can basically be convinced of that. And it seems like a lot of the political class seems very good at motivating Americans to go along with policies using these moralism arguments. Just like we gotta, you gotta go fight the bad guys in whatever foreign country is the problem right now. We got to do the right thing. But you're right that morality is only a tool of propaganda, really, of the state. It's when it's useful they use it. When it's not, they ignore it.
Yeah, that's absolutely true. And they're taking advantage of the fact that the average person, and it doesn't matter where in the world the average person is, all of the 7 or 8 billion people out there, they're basically wired to do what they think is the right thing. Mm-hmm. And even when you look at people like Mao, killed scores of millions of people, he thought he was doing the right and just thing. And so did everybody's favorite bête noire, Adolf. He thought so. Stalin thought so. Pol Pot thought they were doing the right and moral thing, the correct thing. Mm-hmm. So this morality argument is a slippery slope because people just were relying about their gut feelings, okay, which may or may not have anything to do with logic or reason.
One of the things I also heard about, and I think most Americans don't understand when you talk about this all being unpayable, they don't understand like how large the interest expense is getting and how absolutely out of control it is. And I believe I saw a figure recently that suggested that the interest on the debt was about nearly equal at this point to the military budget.
Yeah, although it's indeterminate exactly how large the military budget is.
Well, they can't do an audit effectively, but
no, they've tried that and failed completely. No, this is totally and completely out of control, where the US government has become such a gigantic behemoth, it's unmanageable. And there are so many people that have interests in things staying exactly how they are and growing. Everybody that runs a department or a bureau in the government realizes that the only way he can grow in power and raise his GS status is by spending more and managing more people. So it's to absolutely everybody's interest in the government that the government continue growing.
Right. It
So
only goes, it's a ratchet. It only goes one way, right?
yeah, exactly. But we've gotten to the point now over 150 years where the government, from being tiny and capable of being funded by basically import duties and excise taxes, that was it. Total source of government income, now controls 50% of the US economy. So it's become unsustainable, that word they just love. And it's that 100-story building is going to collapse unexpectedly. Now, is it going to happen this time? No, this kabuki theater will play out with, a bunch of these completely worthless scumbag politicians getting to grandstand and play the faulted logic that both of them are using. But I don't know how much further it can go, because we are on the point where we can have a financial collapse, followed by an economic collapse, followed by social upheaval, and then, a military adventure that gets completely out of hand. Well, right now, the Ukraine, but the main show is going to be with China if that ever happens. So we're really on the edge of something really nasty at this point, and the debt's part of it. So I suggest defaulting on the debt.
Yeah, I don't think it's that, there's, just as in all of the cases, there's a lot of talk before about how the great risk that might happen, and there's all magically they end up, coming to some agreement and the 11th hour to solve it. And I'm just reading this Reuters article from, I guess it's from earlier today. And, there was a meeting between, all the leaders and on both sides of the house with the White House, and leaving that, they said, Biden said the leaders reached, quote, an overwhelming consensus that defaulting on the debt is simply not an option. Our economy would fall into recession.
Well, it's already falling into recession. And of course, Paul Krugman, who although he was given a Nobel Prize for economics, came up with the cockamamie scheme of fabricating a $1 trillion coin, which, since the government can mint coins, it can do that. Okay, that'll work. But this is the nature of, kind of people that win Nobel Prizes today. It's a hokum solution. And if so, well, why fabricate just $1 trillion coin?
We could use a few of those, I think, couldn't we?
Yeah, 10 or 20. The platinum's only $1,000 an ounce, more or less, right now. So, yeah, that makes a lot of sense.
Yeah, I even saw an article that was saying, well, how big would the coin be if they did it? And they said, oh no, it'd just be a normal size coin. That's what they said. They wouldn't waste the metal. Why? You don't have to do a big one.
Well, none of our other coins are worth anything in terms of metal content. So why should the new platinum coin be any different?
Exactly. Yeah, it'd be hollowed out.
Yeah, exactly.
Well, I guess we'll see what happens in the next couple of days, because I think they'll probably figure out a resolution, or else, I think we have a couple of weeks left at this point. But it's hard to imagine a honest default from such a dishonest system could happen.
Yeah, it's an insoluble problem. So they'll find some way to patch it over and keep the charade going, keep the kabuki play going for a little bit longer. But soon, reality is going to overwhelm them. And the whole thing's going to collapse into a giant steaming mess.
Yeah. Music will stop and there will not be enough chairs. That's for sure. We'll leave it there for today, Doug, and we'll be back with questions from our file members. If you want to know more about our file, click on the link in the description below. It's our private member group, and we'll be back with, as I said, questions on Friday. So thanks, Doug.
Thanks.